So let me pick up on the theme of the Knight's Move for a moment. First of all, Nabokov says, um, as one of his characters say uh, in an earlier novel, um, that any truly original work of art is a Knight's Move um, away from its predecessors, right? Um, so there's the sort of general thing, but it's also, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's also a technique that shows up in the writing, and I want to look at a couple of instances of this. It's used a number of different ways, but for the most part, in this novel, it's a way of skipping over violence, right, and danger and difficulty, which is something we can absorb into our thinking about how Humbert operates. So to start with, on page 10, this is as Humbert is beginning to tour us through his early life. 3 lines down from the top of the page. My very photogenic mother died in a freak accident, and then the parentheses, picnic, lightning, when I was 3, and save for a pocket of warmth in the darkest past, nothing of her subsists within the hollows and dells of memory, over which, if you can still stand my style, I am writing under observation. The sun of my infancy had set. So 2 parentheticals here, and they are the 2 sort of elements of danger or difficulty or tension even in the passage I read. So first of all, the mother's death, which ought to be, one would think, and it tore through my past life, my earlier life, ought to be something that gets some weight, some real treatment, is given only these 2 nouns, right, joined by a comma and set off in parentheses, so that the violence of the death is hopped over. And then similarly, as he reveals later, right, he's under psychiatric observation, having been arrested for the murder of Quilty. And that is also sort of jumped over, right? Another element of this narrative, of this moment, of the narration itself, that one would expect to be treated, given a kind of prominence, treated with seriousness, is instead just sort of hopped over. And the rest of that passage is in an entirely other tone. And if you were to read, as I will here in a moment, without those Knight's Move moments of violence or danger or difficulty, then there's a certain sort of lush lyrical quality to the whole thing. And so those moments are hopped over, it would seem, in order to preserve this lush lyrical quality. So my very photogenic mother died in a freak accident when I was 3, and save for a pocket of warmth in the darkest past, nothing of her subsists within the hollows and dells of memory, over which, if you can still stand my style, the sun of my infancy had set. So we feel those, one way perhaps to describe it is that we feel those hopped over, those all but excluded moments of violence in a particular way, right? As ruptures, as intrusions upon this lush lyricism, and we might feel their weight, their significance in the way, rather than have their weight and their significance sort of excavated and developed on the page for us. Rather, we feel them perhaps in their neglect, right, in their relative absence. And I want to say something similar about the way in which they're used. These Knight's Moves are used to skip over the violence done to Lolita herself. So there's one instance, the Carmen Barman scene on the couch very early on, in which Humbert recognizes the bruises on Lolita, and although they're attributed not to his handling of her, right, we nonetheless the sense of her being in danger is transmitted in a similar way. But I want to look at a sort of stronger, more powerful example. first of all, on page 192, um, at the bottom of the section that's carried over from 191, um, we have the term Knight's Move sort of provided for us, and we'll look at that very briefly. So, about 6 lines up from the bottom of that paragraph, then Dolly arrived and slid her eyes at us. I left the two friends to their own devices. One of the lattice squares in a small cobwebby casement window at the turn of the staircase was glazed with ruby, and that raw wound among the unstained rectangles and its asymmetrical position, a Knight's Move from the top, always strangely disturbed me. And so here, of course, is the term the Knight's Move and the image, right, of that Knight's Move on the chessboard, associated with a raw wound and a disturbing feeling. So with this in mind, I want to just sort of flip back to 175 onto 176. So this is, in the midst of their road trip, 3 lines from the bottom of 195. We had been everywhere. We had really seen nothing. And I catch myself thinking today that our long journey had only defiled with a sinuous trail of slime the lovely, trustful, dreamy, enormous country that by then, in retrospect, was no more to us than a collection of dog-eared maps, ruined tour books, and old tires, and her sobs in the night. Every night, the moment I feigned sleep. And Lolita's agony here, right, is also sort of skipped over. And of course, his manipulation of her, right, feigning sleep, and then the sobs that followed, right, have their moment, then they're skipped over, and we pick up then in chapter 4 of this section, and on we go. Right? So the Knight's Move as a sort of aesthetic principle, the Knight's Move is a technique that is stealable, right, that we can apply to our own work, possessed of certain powers, right, the powers of suggestion, the powers of indirection, the powers of neglect, right, or of felt absence. But in this novel in particular, a move that allows an acknowledgement of suffering on Lolita's part without the cause of that suffering, Humbert, who's up to his own ends, having to stop and dwell on it, right, or elaborate upon it for our benefit. So I want to look at one other predecessor here, and then pause and come at the novel from another direction. So this other predecessor is Joyce, and so what Nabokov is explicit about loving in Joyce are the following things. One, what he calls stylistic virtuosity, which is Joyce's ability to write in multiple styles, equally well, equally powerfully. Attention to banality. Joyce is able to root up, and this is probably most obviously clear in Dubliners, or the experiences you've had with Dubliners. Anyway, I shouldn't have said that. But to pay attention to the banalities of lived existence and to find in those banalities things of art. 3, the use of a superimposed structure. Think of, borrowing from Homer, right, to create a structure, as a way of structuring this day in Dublin and Ulysses. Or even in Portrait of the Artist, right, which also has its spatial qualities in that each of the chapters are sort of linked, right, by the repetition of motifs and refer to each other, and so forth. So superimposed structure, the banality of life, the superimposed structure, suggesting something I mentioned earlier, which is perhaps it's in the artist's work, the banality of everyday life, right, is saved, redeemed in some way. The relationship to these elements of Joyce is a little bit complicated. First of all of his predecessors, in Lolita anyway, Nabokov acknowledges Joyce, um, in, by by letting us know that Vivian Darkbloom, right, this sort of character, um, this other writer on the margins of this novel, um, has plagiarized from Joyce, and in her case, from Finnegan's Wake. Vivian Darkbloom, of course, right, rearranged those letters, and you've got Vladimir Nabokov. And Vivian Darkbloom um, was a pseudonym, right, that Nabokov wrote under early in his career, and she appears in a number of works, even his memoir. Um, so this is a way of acknowledging, right, Nabokov's debt to Joyce. But the particulars of it, of the way in which Joyce appears in this novel, very directly are interesting. Um, on page 151, carried over into 152, is this this list of names, this roster of names of the students in Lolita's class. And on 152, having provided us with the list of names, Humbert says, a poem forsooth, so strange and sweet was it to discover this haze Dolores, she, in its special bower of names, with its bodyguard of roses, the fairy princess between her two maids of honor, etc. So this class list, Humbert sees it as, right, as a poem. Well, the origins of that are in Portrait of the Artist as an Old Man. The beginning of chapter 2 describes the hero, Stephen Dedalus, trying to write a poem. And in this case, he fails, but it forecasts a success that takes place later on. And he's trying at the beginning of chapter 2 to write the poem, but is distracted, right, and fails. And here's how the text reads at the very opening of chapter 2. The next day he sat at his table in the bare upper room for many hours. Before him lay a new pen, a new bottle of ink, and an emerald exercise notebook. From force of habit, he had written at the top of the first page the initial letters of the Jesuit motto, AMDG. On the first line of the page appeared the title of the verses he was trying to write, to E.C. He knew it was right to begin so, for he had seen similar titles in the collected poems of Lord Byron. When he had written this title and drawn an ornamental line underneath, he began to daydream and draw diagrams on the cover of the book. He saw himself sitting at the table in Bray the morning after the discussion at the Christmas dinner table, trying to write a poem about Parnell on the back of his father's second moiety notes. But his brain had then refused to grapple with the theme, and desisting, he had covered the page with the names and addresses of certain of his classmates, Roderick Kickham, John Lawton, Anthony McSwinney, Simon Moonan. So this is the source material, right? This is Nabokov is giving us a kind of riff on this Joycean moment in Portrait of the Artist. But there's a significant difference between them, right? In the same way that that he parodies Eliot, or in a way similar to his parodying of Eliot's poem. I want us to look at the poem, right, made up of this list of names, and think about the difference between what Stephen Dedalus is doing, what Joyce has him do in Portrait of the Artist, and Humbert's experience here. In Portrait of the Artist, it's the scene is of these sort of common details, right? The banality of the world, including the list of names, right, that Stephen Dedalus writes, and the effort is to produce out of these banal details, right, a work of art, a thing of beauty. But in Humbert's case, in Lolita's case, there isn't an effort. It's already there upon reading the list, right? A poem forsooth. It's already there. And how is it already there? That we'll look at the names, right? I mean, to pick a couple, and to do them sort of in the order in which they appear in the list. Angel Grace, right? and then the Bower of Roses, right? Mary Rose Hamilton and Rosaline Honick. On the other side, there's Kenneth Knight, um, Vivian McChrystal, Aubrey McFate. Uh, so that the names are already sort of right, the pair of Talbots at the end. Um, these names are already invested with uh, with the stuff of poetry, right? With a grandeur, with a kind of with the same beauty, the same kind of beauty that the midges have. Back to the Hotel Marana, right? They're not irritating bugs; they're golden midges. Um, this world that Humbert lives in, right, doesn't have to be doesn't have to undergo a metamorphosis or transmutation. The banality doesn't have to go through a process by which it becomes art. It's already present, right? It is already there. And think about this particular name, Aubrey McFate. McFate being a sort of loose idea that Humbert becomes kind of obsessed with. If you think about its relationship to fate, right? Itself, we have a kind of right. We have a kind of awareness of the way in which um, Nabokov is diffusing some of the seriousness of his inheritance from the Paleo moderns by way again, right, of parody. Um, it's not fate. It's not the stuff of life that has to be worked, but it's this kind of prefabricated, think I guess of Chicken McNuggets, right? This kind of prefabricated version of fate, a false fate. It's already falsified in an important way, right? It's not about the real world. It's about this already false, already aestheticized world, right? McFate. um, it's already artificial, and the artificial has already taken the place of the real, right? If you think about the relationship of this class list to Joyce's, in that case, the real, right, having to be worked into a poem, and it already has the feel of the artificial. And there are multiple ways we can think about the way that this threads into the text. One of which is to think about the America that is presented to us on the road trip. And Lolita, right, is the subject and the object of every advertisement. This is a world corrupted um, by the falsifications of a kind of quasi-narrative or a Mick narrative presented by way of advertising. There are other ways as well, right? But we'll leave it at that. All right, so I'll take the break. I'm a little bit over time anyway, and then come back for the last installment, what I think will be the last installment.